So thank you, Daniel, for being here. It's such a pleasure. As you know, this is a research from the Leicester University Museum Studies program. I'm Lucimara Letelier, and I'm researching regenerative museums concept. And the idea of starting this conversation is firstly to ask you just the protocols, if you have seen the consent form, privacy notice, and everything.
All of that, and lovely to see you again. And I remember when we met in Rio at the workshop that I did there in 2019. So it's really nice to have this opportunity to be interviewed.
Yes, and it was great to start my journey with you there as well. So basically,
Did you actually start recording? I can't see the recording.
Yes, I did. If you can.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. There we go. Okay. Now we go.
It is recording. Just you have accepted. So basically, we are looking to how museums can incorporate regenerative thinking to transform their core functions, their strategic thinking, perhaps to become more effective and ethical catalyst for society, not only to mitigate and adapt to the social and environment collapse, but also to have more an ethical fiber on how they deal with social and environmental issues. And museums, they have increasingly committed with sustainable development, with the 2030 agenda, but regenerative thinking could be looked at something new to them if you look at some of the theories. But for a lot of them are not new. They are actually practicing regenerative thinking for quite a while, but it's not named as such. So I think the research is also trying to rise and to bring these possibilities of regenerative seeds in museums. So initially, what I want to hear from you, having looking all the literature that is available in terms of regeneration, it's how do you think the regenerative thinking could be applied to museums? But I want to give just you a background so we can remember and remind ourselves what is the place of museums, what is the territory of museums. So we are talking about area that encapsulates the idea of safeguarding our planetary history, because museums have a rule and a role of safeguarding our previous history, which includes biological information, but also include the idea that they have produced a lot of knowledge about past extinctions that we have there, but they also have seed banks for biodiversity. And there are two sides of it. One is the capacity to influence billions of people in terms of awareness, but there are other areas which is acting on behalf of more ethical, social and environmental way of thinking. So what is the potential of the regenerative thinking to the museums, take into consideration this territory that the museums cohabit?
Well, I actually think that your research and what you're exploring, and with that, the dialogue that you will trigger in the museums world is probably one of the highest potential leverage points of culture change that I've come across. So like, I just want to applaud the importance of your research and the importance of the questions you just asked. Because ultimately, we need to bring the conversation about the polycrisis or the world problematique or the meta crisis, which are all framings that are born out of the pattern of abstraction that underlies most of our scientific discourse and educational system today. They're always asking, here's a problem, how does it show up everywhere? How can we define it better? You get more and more experts define the problem in international conferences, but in that process, you generalize a specific instance into a generalized category, what you call that problem. And then we begin to look systemically at it, and we mix all the problems together, and we call it a meta crisis. And what is at the heart of the nuanced difference of how regenerative practice invites a different approach than most sustainable sustainable development practice, which is still in that problem solution framework, is that regenerative practice invites you to come home to the specificity of context. Call it place, call it bioregion, call it community, call it locality. It's when you suddenly look at the world's problems through that lens of specificity, of turning into the skid and looking at how these issues show up in the context of a real landscape, a real ecosystem, a real community with people with names and faces and history, then suddenly in that context, you can begin to see that what we call problems is also potential, unmanifest. And that's one of the core learnings in this nuanced approach of regeneration, that we need to work with the specificity and enable what is already latent in the system, rather than design a solution and then find a step-by-step process to implement it. And so any kind of cultural institution that can hold and initiate and stimulate the dialogue about who are we in this place and how are we expressions of this place and how are we custodians and caretakers of this place, and the wider contextual awareness that the only way we can serve ourselves and our communities by keeping this place in this context alive and thriving and healthy. That is really at the heart of regeneration, and it's at the heart of the cultural process, which in my book I call living the questions together, like not being solution focused, but trying to collectively learn more and more about a place, about the context, so we can understand the rhythms of that place and how it functions, and we can become appropriate participants in that context, and begin to have more likely a healing, regenerating, positive effect on that nested system than a degenerative and extractive effect, which is what we're stuck in at the moment as a culture. And that all said, it's also really important when we say, what can regeneration bring to museums, is that that's dangerously close to the framing as if regeneration is a concept that has recently been proposed and that we now need to apply. Personally, I think that misses a massive point. I come from the biological sciences originally, and my mentor, Fritjof Capra, who was a physicist and then understood that it's the ecological and biological sciences that actually help humanity survive in the long term, and wrote a fantastic book called The Systems View of Life. Fritjof once, in a conversation that I had with him, called regeneration the essence of life's capacity to self-organize. It's at the heart of how our cells function and functions, and how our cells communicate with other cells in a way that they're constantly regenerating themselves. They don't stay the same. Similarly, our organs don't stay the same. Our whole body regenerates itself multiple times in our lifetime. And if we anchor regeneration back into life itself, and even more in that context, then anchor our own, and this is where it comes back to museums, anchor our entire history back into the fact that for the longest part of the human journey, we have been regenerative expressions of place. We have been what Lila June in her recent PhD, Architects of Abundance, called Architects of Abundance, where she basically demonstrates, mainly focused on North America, that the entire diversity and ecosystems dynamics of large parts of North America have been co-created by its indigenous inhabitants, and that there are areas that to this day are far more bioproductive and diverse because these areas have been inhabited by human beings. So it flies in the face of this narrative that humans are a cancer on the planet. No, we haven't been that. And to this day, indigenous people all around the world showed that we still can be architects of abundance, because the biodiversity hotspots of the planet are under indigenous land management. So there are still people who are keeping that tradition alive of being custodians and caretakers of the ecosystems they inhabit. And it's vitally important that we remember that. Also that we remember that for a large part of our survival biologically and evolutionary as a species, we were pre-verbal and therefore pre-conceptual and therefore pre-analytical thought and analysis and science and technology. But we had the capacity through sensing, feeling, and intuiting, the other three ways of knowing that we've developed evolutionary for much, much longer, to make wise decisions about survival. Otherwise, you and I wouldn't be here. Our ancestors, through sensing, feeling, and intuiting, survived. And even today's psychological research shows that we actually make most important decisions through sensing, feeling, and intuiting, and then post-rationalize them. All of this is just to give you a context to say, imagine museums as they're beginning to stepping up and becoming two critical things. One, places for this dialogue of how do we fit back into this place? How do we, in a world of cascading collapse of systems that no longer serve, that we've created over the last 250 or 5,000 years, how do we use museums as initiators of true community resilience? Because true community resilience is when people get to know each other and their place again to the level of depth that if their place is disrupted, they already know what they're working with and who they're working with, because they have met each other and they have learned about their place. So any activity that is in a particular place facilitating that people reconnect with the deeper knowledge of their place, traditions, history, ecosystems, the context of the planetary situation mirrored in the local, even what's not working, like to begin to have a dialogue of this is what we've got, how do we really want that, can we change it? And at the same time, we have a wealth of information and data that we created through this abstraction system that has lots of different disciplines in the universities, which are also always talking about globalized, generalized patterns rather than specific patterns. The specific is a case that statistic kind of pushes to the side rather than highlights. And it's in the specific that you can become regenerative and healing. So how would a museum collaborate with the local university to become a knowledge transfer center that invites every single discipline in a university to say, yes, we do chemistry, or no, we do literature, or we do social science, or we do biology. But then the next question is, what do we know about biology or social science or literature that is relevant to this place? And how can you take this information and make it interesting and engaging and interconnected through the lens of place and region? And begin to basically become bioregional learning centers, places where if you go to a museum, you leave knowing more about your context. And the more you do that, you build your own capability of being able to meaningfully and effectively and wisely participate in that context. And for me, that's ultimately what the huge potential of museums are. Sorry for a very long answer.
Well, just following up on what you just said, I think you are quite right in terms of the caretakers of our nature history, our nature history and native histories. But one of the things that we have been facing is museums have translated history on behalf of our native people from this land in such a way that it's very much shaped by the Anthropocene perspective. It's very much shaped by Industrial Revolution. It's very much shaped by ways of thinking that it's very modern thinking, and not necessarily are the voices of the original people that traditionally would be regenerative voices speaking throughout the museum. So one of the things that we talked before is the notion of ecomuseums, because ecomuseums have a center concept, the idea of being community-based, of being the expression of the voices of the people of the territory, which is very much regenerative as a baseline, as a principle that is there. But if you think about the major museums, the big museums, the museums that are in urban areas, and most of them were colonial instruments when in the orange. What I'm trying to move now, the next question, it's about the living principles. Of course, the living system principles, when we think about nestedness, when we think about the whole idea of essence and potential that you already have been touched upon, it's all about thinking on how we design as nature instead of design to nature. And I have been thinking how we bring museums professionals to exercise that. And you mentioned one thing about the 3 levels, which is thinking, experiencing, and feeling. And museums have been doing a lot on the thinking. And most of these narratives have been shaped by the cognitive senses. And we are having questions on how regeneration can bring the notion of feeling and experiencing together with the people who are actually the owners of these stories, and museums being the conveyors and being the bridge for this encounter between the Anthropocene shaped people and the original people who these stories come from. But my question to you is, how do we reconcile these 2 approaches? The fact that museums have been authoritative, have been mechanicists, have been business-like manner, and we are now inviting them, perhaps, with the regenerative thinking, to be much more nature thinking with eco lenses. Do you think, how do you would approach and think about how regenerative principles could be exercised in the museum sector, understanding that they're coming from this very much Anthropocene way of thinking and working?
But I mean, for me, a regenerative response to that would be to say that always depends on the context and the specific museum you're talking about. Because then suddenly it's in the dysfunctionality that might exist at the moment that there's a story that connects to context and place that you can use as the entry point to have a conversation that transforms that dysfunctionality. Of course, also like museums, like, for example, modern art museums and art museums are slightly different. Like the transformation of them could be different because it could be through the artists. The artists themselves could call in a different way of being represented in that museum. But the museums that are more kind of historical and anthropological, showing artifacts of cultures, I mean, they are to some extent one of the most perverse examples of colonialization, of having robbed other people's sacred objects out of their sacred context and then displayed them completely out of context with a narrative that is still to this day very much a sort of how interesting these primitive cultures had so much to show for themselves, instead of understanding how primitive was it to even have the arrogance to call those cultures primitive, which is really what we still have to learn in the North. That we were the mistaken ones on the detour. And these cultures that we exploited were the ones that were still connected to life's regenerative impulse and how to be custodians of place. So in that field, there is such a profound unlearning necessary, such a profound humility, such a profound need for reparation and decolonialization, of returning artifacts, of making the journey of that return a deep healing process, and a process that in and of itself has regenerative elements in it, in the sense that another distinction, there's a lot that I've learned from Regenesis Group and Kara about nuancing what regenerative practice is as opposed to business as usual. And I think another one that is really important to highlight is that as a culture, whether it's in museums or in design or in engineering or in anything we do, we are very object focused. And so even the conversation about how would we create regenerative museums could so easily end up in a sidetrack that is all about what would be the shape of a regenerative museum and how would be the interior design and all of that, like how would be what would it look like? Yeah. And you can start much earlier than that. It already starts with your research right now. The entire process of reconceptualizing, the entire process of shifting the museum's world, if conceived of regeneratively, will increase the capacity of the people involved, everybody involved, the clients, the people in the museum, the designers, the people who go to the museum, the communities where they are, the financiers, all of them, increase the capacity, their capacity to see museums in context, to understand the power of museums, to understand their culture in context, to understand the significance of the different roles that each and every one of them are holding, and how all of that has a potential to have a larger field effect that can heal the system and support the system to be more able to evolve into the future. That's what regeneration focuses on. It doesn't mean that you can't regeneratively deliver a product through product design, or build a house through architecture, or do urban planning, or build a museum. But if you only focused on the outcome, that product, you're missing the much bigger outcome, which is how do you make this a conversation and a process from the start where everybody can learn? And by increasing that capacity of understanding our participation in a living, nested context, we then also can begin to hone our capabilities to meaningfully participate in that context.
Just going back to this idea of places, the whole idea of potentially healing places by restoring its vitality. Mm-hmm. Lots of examples of regenerative projects, especially from Regenesis, are related to neighborhoods, cities, territories, landscapes, spaces where they have concentrated to look at the stories of this place, and from there developed a regenerative approach. Museums, as we're discussing here, sometimes they can be located in a place, in a city, but they are representing the story of another place, which is not here, because of the objects, because of the stories they're telling, because the collection. And you're quite right, the movement of restoration, of repatriation, reinstitution, which is basically giving back the sacred objects, or even the objects that tell the stories of another place, it's not only bring a new energy to both systems, because it's reciprocal, both the museum here and the ecosystem where this object was installed, it's also somehow brings a new vitality. So what I want to bring is the notion of place. In the case of museums, could that be expanded when you think about regenerative development purposes? I want to give you an example. The Manchester Museum, they have given back shells to the Australian island, but they decided to do this by they created something that is quite new in the museum, which is called Living Cultures Curator, which is someone that minds the stories that are behind this object much more than the object itself. He's not a specialist in the object. He's a specialist on the people who care for this object and the sacred stories behind it. And they did it with such a care that co-created a relationship between the curators and the people of the island. And somehow, just by bringing these shells by a community engagement process, brought new life to this island so they can remember their stories. And it created a flow of mutuality. On the other hand, if we think about France, Macron has created a report requesting the repatriation of the Benin bronze to Benin, which is great, but it's a different way of doing it. The how in this case was very important, because it's not just about sending the objects, it's an equation on how to do it. So what I want to bring is, what potential do you see in terms of the whole idea of bringing back vitality and the spirit and the essence of place when you're thinking about museums, process of restoring and rebalancing these two systems, the museum stories itself and the place where these objects belong?
I think it's really important to understand that place is fractal, in the sense that it's not a rigid locality. Meaning, I sit here on Mallorca. Well, I sit on a piece of land that I'm the custodian of, which is on the island of Mallorca, which is in the Balearic Islands, which is part of Spain, which is part of Europe, which is part of this planet. The place I'm in is all those places. I'm on this planet. And so if you understand that, then what you're just talking about, those two examples, are also about an opportunity. They're beautiful examples because they're both huge opportunities to make us relate to the nestedness of place, and to also say, to open up possibly one of the most culturally transformative questions for the northern cultures, which is, maybe we have forgotten our rightful place in the community of life. And can we, by repatriating objects we robbed in that process of being dissociated from place, from our place in the community of life, it's ultimately, when you look at these type of processes, almost always what you're meeting is the return from a anthropocentric culture perspective to a kin-centric cultural perspective. Most of those objects were created in cultures that lived in a context where life is a community and mutual codependence is understood. The kin-centric perspective, all life is family. And if all those repatriation and processes created true opportunities for people to learn from each other, as this is beginning to happen, for people, and as you said, with these cultural curators, like the stories behind the objects, but the nestedness of the context, there's so much of unlearning and really understanding the depth of our arrogance in the global north to tell a story that made us, because we had some fancy science and some fancy technology, we thought that this was the proof that this was the way things needed to go. But we've completely forgot that there's a deeper wisdom that is about relational interbeing, about fitting into place, about being custodians of place and this living planet, that is a fundamental rule of life, that is part of life's regenerative impulse. And if we don't fit into that, we don't have a future, bar a few thousand years where we keep degrading a living fabric and a living planet, which is what we've done over the last few thousand years.
Yeah, and I think it's very beautiful, the image of the fractal idea of place, because also brings me to the whole idea of time and space. And I came across, I didn't read all the books of Capra, but of course I through Gaia education, I had been exposed to Frida Capra work, and a lot of it of feeling and understanding that social systems are expressions of living systems. And when I'm trying to all the time seeing how museums can be seen as a living system in itself, and understand how the issue of time and space in museums it shouldn't be so linear as it has been. And how do we then look into the potential of co-creating a new future in the museum spaces by taking this opportunity that people are in museums, in sacred spaces, not always, but sometimes we have a level of contemplation and a level of field of energy in museums that allow us to look at place, time, and spaces in a different way, and create a new quality for dialogue, especially among the diversity. I'm very much interested into this, and I think I'm looking to museums who have been opening spaces for this to happen.
I think this is another. I'm really impressed by your research, because there's like, not only is anything that enables people to build, to improve their capacity to understand this nestedness with regard to space, spatial scale linking from the small, like whether you call it cell, organ, individual, family, community, bioregion, nation, if you want to, planet, or whether you call it local, regional, national, global, with regard to what place are we acting in. This understanding how they are nested in each other, and how our action in locality is actually either destroying or saving the planet, and how our collective action in place as custodians of place and healers of place and caretakers of place is the most effective and possibly the only real action we can do collectively to support planetary health. And enabling, in terms of political structures, that people in place can become healers, restorers, and regenerators of their place, is the way that we can, through stirring into the skid of specificity and real people and real places, heal the global problems, solve the global problems, not by saving the planet, but by saving ourselves and our relationship to place. And in that process, changing our negative effect to a positive effect on the planet. But so that's one side of it. But I love the fact that you highlighted the other really important dimension, which is the time dimension. And we get stuck in the very limited linear time perspective that is also part of the anthropocentric narrative that, in its most perverse expression, has then tried to name an entire era after itself, the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, by some people, is even celebrated as something positive, as if like proud that we now have the massive impact on the globe. But I don't know if you read this recently. The geologists have actually turned down the notion that this era should be called Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is not officially a geological era now. It was a proposition that has not been upheld.
This is
And I
very
think
recent. This is
in the
very
in the last 2 or 3 months, I think that the decision came out. And for me, that's great because we should really explore these notions of the symbiocene or the ecozoic, as Thomas Berry called it a long time ago, that actually re-enter humanity into the context of a nested living planet. Well, back to time. Because in this time question and the role that universities can, that museums can play in it, and that dialogue of opening up towards circularity of time again. Because again, if you look at all the more anthropological, historical robbed objects that you find in northern museums, they're not only robbed from a kin-centric culture, they're robbed from a culture in which time most likely had a circular rather than a linear dimension. It was marked by the seasons and by nestedness of seasons, but how many years you've clocked in terms of numbers was relatively unimportant. It was cycles of life, phases of life, patterns and larger patterns. And that opens up, again, an opportunity not just for repatriating objects, but for actually questioning the Western worldview and its limitations and learning a new understanding of circularity. And then in another dimension, hold on, because I just lost my train of thought. Yeah. The danger of this opening up time is to then ultimately still stay in a pattern that is Western, which is what role can museums play to create another future? That pattern in itself is part of the linear Western pattern of envisioning a future and then implementing it. It's very engineering-like. It's very sort of Western. What I think would be much more powerful and, to my mind, more regenerative is for museums to really challenge this notion of saying, we've tried for years to do design charrettes or community processes where we envision a future and then we're disappointed that 15 years later it hasn't been implemented. Maybe what we need to do when we work with time is to pay attention to what a mentor of mine, Anthony Hodgson, has called the future potential of the present moment. And what I understand in this powerful notion of the future potential of the present moment is actually a fundamentally regenerative notion, which is, again, don't lose yourself in the abstract of talking about a potential future. Come into the specific of how everybody right now and how they are participating in this nested system that the museum can hold space for, this place nested. How are they contributing to either futuring or defuturing? How are they contributing to healing, sharing, caring, nurturing, protecting, reconnecting, healing? Or are they continuing to contribute to separating, competing, exploiting, extracting, distancing? And in that dialogue, you can then really highlight through the museum the importance of everybody. And for me, that, like, how do you create fundamental change in a system that you're a participant in, but you cannot predict and control it, which is the lesson of complexity theory. Yeah? You have to pay attention to the quality of relationships in the system. You have to pay attention to the quality of the information that flows in the system, and you have to increase the capacity of the system to see itself. All three of those, I would dedicate a chapter on those 3 points for museums. How can museums increase the quality of relationships in the system between people, the relationships between people and their place, the relationship between people and their history and other people's history and humanity's history, and the divide between global north and global south, all of that. How can And it's all about the quality of information. It's not about fancy data, statistics, and numbers. It's about narratives and human relationships there. And then how do can museums increase the quality of information that flows in the system? So actually invite the process of unlearning that is necessary so the true learning can even land. Like over and over again, help people to make visible the glasses that they forgot they're wearing. We're so stuck in our Western worldview and its patterns that we need to find museums as processes that help us to become aware of our own blind spots, which is the way we see the world and the way we think about the world. And then the other bit is, and that's crucial, is museums have this capacity to invite people back into their context. And even a museum, as you were pointing out, that might have artifacts that relate to another place can powerfully land people in their context and open up precisely this dialogue of how are we related being in this context to people in other contexts that somebody in our ancestry stole these objects from and they're now here. And how do we relate to this place, and how is our healing of this bioregion relevant to their healing of their bioregion, and what is our obligation as the descendants of the people who stole these objects to maybe, as part of the repatriation of these objects, create a relationship with these people that is of true mutual respect and learning, that isn't of the arrogance of, yeah, I think we should give these back to these people. Well, like sort of, it's much more a kind of, wow, what an opportunity we missed in actually having a deeper dialogue with these people at the time when we stole those objects, and where would we be as humanity had we not followed that detour?
Thank you for this, because I think it opened up for me the roots for the next discussion, which is about the people who are working the museums. But I want to bring back the notion that you brought about what I would call the ways of interpretation in museums, when we look into the potential of bringing all the ways of creating interaction between the visitor and experiencing the objects and the stories. So I'll give an example. I visited 2 weeks ago Stonehenge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about circularity of time. It's very sacred space. I cried so much when I went there, and people didn't understand, because I feel that most of these places of heritage, of course, they contain energy, they can be ritualized, they can be a space of dialogue between past, present, and future in a very, if you create a container for that energy, that it's there. But not necessarily we know how to do it. Not necessarily we know how to facilitate this as museums professionals, and I can include myself. I think I'm learning. But what the essence is, those places are becoming amusement parks. Those places are becoming place of taking pictures and run and go to the next place. And it's all about this extractive mindset, but it's also an idea of just observing, not being part of this landscape, which was huge for me in terms of learning of the sacredness of the people who from this land. I am here in the UK for 1 year, and I respect the sacredness of this place, but I haven't seen before, because it's not, for me, easy to see. This place brought me to the sacredness of the people who lived in this territory before, and I stayed there and I sat on the floor and I meditate. So my point is, there are lots of new capacities we would need to bring to the museum's professionals, or not bring, to recall them, to awake them, to allow them, to give space for them, to co-create a new way of interpretation. Lots of museums professionals have a great knowledge of how Native people ritualized these objects in the past, how the stories behind these heritage spaces were very circular and were very sacred for these spaces. But how do we then translate this to the generation of visitors who are exposed to these objects, which could hold lots of potential for new ways of interacting with the present? So my question to you is about regenerative leadership. Of course, I have been looking at the book of Gilles and Laura of Regenerative Leadership. I'm also very interested in the work of Frederic Laloux on the Reinvent Organizations, which is about remembering museums that what we are suggesting as a regenerative journey, it's not just for museums, it's a potential a way of thinking that transform all the social systems as well as universities, as the schools. But there is something specific about museums, because one thing that we talked before on our other webinar was about the potential of 100,000 museums globally. They have a lot of influence in education, formal schools. They have a lot of influence in the university. So just an example, in Brazil, when the Portugal comes, the university doesn't come with them. The first cultural institution is a museum. It's not a university. The university comes after this because of the whole structure that we discussed before. But you brought in your book a lot of notion about shifting worldviews. And museums have this potential. It's not just subjective potential, it's a clear potential of shifting worldviews. But I feel that it requires regenerative leadership to do so. It requires regenerative leadership in the museums to see that there is a space for a different way of working. And I think the challenge for us is how we invite the museums professionals to enter an experimental journey, an uncertain journey, and a self-development journey. What are your recommendations for museums professionals to enter the regenerative journey themselves to be able to facilitate regenerative thinking in museums?
Well, there are a lot of words that we say, and we kind of assume that because we have a particular understanding of what that word means, the person who hears the word will think the same thing as we do. But actually, what we also know is that very often in life, when somebody says freedom, another person understands a very different thing under freedom. Or when somebody says love, not everybody understands the right thing, the same thing. And in a similar way, I think the word leadership for so many people still lands in a context of the hero's journey, like the one who changes things, the agency, the must change things. I'm a change maker. And I think we're now at a point in human history where the invitation is for us to understand that there are a series of cascading transformations afoot that we caused by the behavior of our species, not even our species, only a small proportion of our species, that have put many of the life-sustaining systems of the planet in danger and into a dynamic that we now will have to live out. And so the whole notion of change making and being a change maker or a leader of change is also something that we need to examine more closely or question. And a true regenerative leader for me is somebody who facilitates the process of living the questions together in context, with a vision of serving both the community and the planet or place in a nested way, in the best way they can, but not as the follow me individual, but as the careful weaver of relationships that almost intentionally tries to stay as invisible as possible to still be effective. And that's a very different type of leadership, weavership. I think that weaving is the 21st century leadership. And in that context, you could say that the danger of museums is, you're right, there are highly trained individuals that know a lot about these objects. But all those disciplines need a careful examination of how a particular worldview has shaped those stories about our past. And I think one of the powerful conversations that we could have with the living descendants of people in those places who've also been fundamentally influenced by this dominant worldview. So finding the right indigenous leaders that still hold the old knowledge would be crucial there. But to actually open up that conversation of, were these cultures as competitive as we always make them look like? Like what I sense that when I look at a lot of archaeological interpretations of sites, we very quickly go to ritual worshipping, deducing some form of social structure that is with some form of hierarchical concept behind it. And how much of that is our storytelling and how much of it is actually true? And so opening those questions up again to even invite those experts to say, I might be wrong, and to open up those places to that process of learning, of saying, this is the story we tell. And now we've invited somebody from that area who knows about this place, and there might be also an alternative story to tell, which was more about how did we live in relationship to the places these objects emerged from, and what was their context. And so in a more generalized way, there's this beautiful or very often quoted English nursery rhyme. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty took a great fall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I believe that that is about education and about our tendency to abstract from life by dividing it into different disciplines and telling separate stories, the anthropological story, the social story, the economic story, the ecological story, the hydrological story, the geological story, the chemical story, the evolutionary story. I think the true role of museums and universities is bringing the wealth of knowledge we have about these different storylines and then facilitating the conversation in place of, how do these stories fit together? How do we actually begin to understand our place in a richer way through this dialogue of conversation and this forum of conversation? And so what we really need from museum professionals is like being facilitators, being mediators, being space holders, being weavers, being storytellers but always in the how does it, like the focus is on the quality of the relationships and the quality of information flowing in the system, in the sense of, how do we tell a story that heals the system, that heals our social divides, that celebrates diversity in the human system, not as a reason to go to war or to have violent conflict, but celebrates diversity in the human system as life's diversity, and therefore the source of creativity and the potential of ongoing evolution. And creating these fora where people who have diverse opinions about it can be in a space that has a certain sacredness. As you say, the museums has a holding energy over time, that they've been what they are. So in this holding container, to open up a space that is more about living the question that says there is no right and wrong here. There is a invitation to have a conversation about how these things fit together. And it is not about just coming and learning about the past. It's always about making it relevant to how we live in the future, in the present, and to also be more questioning, like to not run in and saying, well, everybody's talking about AI, like how do we now retrofit lots of AI into our museums, which is probably what lots of your colleagues are working on right now. Which is just a kind of rabbiting the current cultural dominant discourse without questioning it. And museums should be the place where, because what happens when you walk into a museum, there's a sense of you slow down a bit, you open up a bit, and you somehow receptive. Otherwise, you wouldn't have stepped into that space. Let's work on that receptivity of exploring something in a new way.
Last week I have a meeting with a colleague from the museum sector, and she was telling me about an artist that has studied this level of heartbeat, this level of energy in the museums, but by having a study of the heartbeat in the museums, and by certain period of time, they synchronize. I'm keen to send you this research.
Please do. That sounds amazing.
Because it's exactly the evidence or the translation of what you were saying, which is the field of energy that museums contains. But she's giving an evidence of this, which is it's very interesting, by the heart. And I always sense it is, but it's so beautiful to see how the artist can translate it.
There's huge potential. Like, also, I just wanted to briefly get back to this whole network of eco-museums, because you were the person who made me even aware that they existed, and I'm really excited about them, because it's precisely that approach of people in place in a small and humble way, without billions of or millions of research funding and architectural funding, saying, we can create a little museum here about part of our history and make it relevant to our present, and encourage a dialogue about safeguarding culture, which is also part of regeneration. Like I found one just recently in the harbor of Campastilla, just outside of Parma. They've created a little eco-museum that is about the yauts. Yauts are a particular type of fishing boat that was developed on the Balearic Islands. And they just basically in this harbor gave free mooring to the oldest yauts on the island. So everybody brought their yacht there to save some money. And now you have this beautiful collection of boats that go back to 1820. But again, when I was there, I thought, how wonderful. It's really connecting people to place. But there is that the nested scale bit of how does this little story sit in the wider story of celebrating the uniqueness of Mallorcan culture, arts and crafts, and the need for a diverse regional economy rather than economy addicted to tourism that too quickly could just make that museum another point to go and visit briefly and then move on to the next entertainment point or the next me picture for social media. I've been there.
I'm doing another project for the audiovisual about how museums can shift perceptions on 13 categories, and each episode will tell about these stories, which I can tell you later. And yesterday I was studying the Ecomuseum of the Amazon and how it was born. And although there is this concept of Ecomuseum, whose author is from the Western perspective from France, Gilles de Varine, from 1972, although he conceptualized this, Ecomuseums has been existed for many years, since many years, although they were not called as such. And as you're saying, it's the beautiful encounter between the cultural knowledge and the biological knowledge of the place. And also making sense of the economical potential of the place conveyed by the cultural knowledge that is there, and creating such a structure that the collection is the living culture. The collection is the trees. The collection are the roots, the journeys, the trails that you can find in an island. In the case of the Amazon, The collection is what you can see, is the rivers. And the interpreters are the people who are there, which is beautiful because they have this knowledge ancestrally developed, so they can tell the story. It's beautiful. And as you said, it brings the notion of regenerative tourism so easily because it was community based developed. The content was community developed. It was not a curator who came and then developed the trails. No, it was them. So it's very truth-based, truth-telling. It's very beautiful. So the Ecomuseum of the Amazon, I think, is the most beautiful one. I can send you a video that express how the women feel so empowered by telling their stories. And the museum platform is an interesting one because it's different from an NGO perspective, because it brings all the possibilities of the social issues with the cultural perspective and the economical perspective all together. Not that an NGO cannot do it, but in Brazil, there's the different notion between what a museum is and a non-profit cause-related organization is. The eco-museums bring both to a beautiful encounter. So, yeah.
In this encounter, that's the other bit that, of course, because our world is a world in which we divide into different professional fields and different academic fields. And these boundaries, to some extent, are also useful because then we have our context in which we have our agency. But I think in any research at this point in human history, the invitation always has to also be to say, okay, how do I avoid that I build a story that is about regenerative museums? And then somebody else builds a story about regenerative schools, and somebody else builds a story about regenerative participatory democracy. And the next person, regenerative urban development, regenerative bioregional development. The true power of museums is to bring all those stories together. To understand that you can't build a regenerative museum if you don't have the dialogue with the local schools and the local universities about how do we instill this love for place in people again, and how do you create love by making people truly know somebody or something. You have to have a deep knowledge of somebody to really be in love. Before it's just infatuation. And so how do we recreate that love? Because that love is ultimately the source out of which we begin to participate regeneratively in the nested system that brings us forth again. And that has a dimension in schools, and how the school museums can support the schools by building the context for a different type of education that isn't just happening in the classroom. It's about working with the local water board and making people aware of the life-giving fundamental importance of water, even in a museum that is about anthropology or about modern art, of bringing the food story and the local food system and the local farmers into the museum by in the cafeteria and what is being sold in the museum. There is a dimension of education that connects people to place through food. Energy, the light switches, you tell people this is from a locally community-owned regenerative renewable energy cooperative. And you in that process teach people about light and energy. The link to the university is clear that you need to invite the different disciplines to bring what they've got, but to create a space where they're outside of the university and not in these hierarchies of I'm so important because I'm professor in my field, but you bring them into a space where I have a lot of knowledge in this, but I'm really keen to hear how that knowledge can actually land meaningfully in this community and in this context, and I'm here to listen as well as to share. And then also we're so urgently need a renewal of people's understanding of democracy as not a spectator sport that happens once every 4 years. You vote and then you watch about the disaster that is unfolding in front of you, but to understand that it's a daily practice of interrelating to each other and to place, and what better forum than a museum to hold that. We need more of those civic spaces. And on a kind of more bleaker note, we need an infrastructure where people can meet when systems really start collapsing.
I think this.
And there's a role in this is important because it's bleak and it's kind of not, we often don't talk about it, but the reality is we are most likely going to live through some of the most disruptive 3 decades, 4 decades that humanity has faced in its history. And there is something that museums can do to build a resilience capacity in anticipation of these events, and to also have another layer behind all this wonderful, beautiful, and healing things and putting people back into relationships. We can also have the other layer of saying all of this is important because we're bringing people together, and that togetherness will be important when things get difficult as well. And at the layer below that, you can then also really begin to prepare and say, okay, this museum can have double functions of being the place where people can come should there be a natural disaster, and like to actually even already now think of museums in that more civic responsibility way, because that will also build a different relationship with the local authorities and the schools and everything. Like suddenly they're really like powerful places where we can rebuild and regenerate community cohesion. So it's the social regeneration and the conversation about economic regeneration, i.e. import substitution and the diversity of diversification of the local economy to create more capacity for regional production, for regional consumption. All of these conversations can also be triggered, supported, catalyzed by museums. Always the whole systems lens and the space where things come together.
A lot of this conversation about the regional consumption and about the industrial basis of each locality has been brought to museums throughout the Sustainable Development Framework. So I just want to have at least your take on the notion of sustainable development and regenerative development, not as opposed approach, but as complementary approach. But before I do this, I just want to touch upon what you said about museums anticipating the notion of how we can build resilience to the collapse. I have been working with this author, Robert James. I don't know if this is going to be here.
Oh, okay, now I can see it. Yeah,
Museums in the Society Collapse. He wrote this book and launched in the beginning of this year. And Robert James, he has been for many years writing about this topic of museums being activists. But this year, he's approaching very much the environmental social collapse. We are both part of a panel in South Korea in July about what is next, the Agenda 2030 for museums. So it's basically looking into the fact that the 2030 agenda has a deadline, and it's very close. It's basically 5 years from now. So let's say 6 years. And the fabric of museums, it's still having a contact of the intersectionality of the work between museums and gender and race, social justice, whatever that it's containing this agenda throughout this framework. It's quite new. It's quite recent to them. Not to all of them, as we said, there are different types of museums, but the ones that have been very much focused on objects and collections and narratives, for them, this is quite new. It's kind of relocating their energy. And we want to value this. We want to make sure, I mean, at least I want to make sure that this is valuable work and that there is intersectionality that has been made visible now, and they have become more active throughout this possible way of working between the crossover between their collections and social justice, which is great. But I want to hear from you how we can bring maybe the regenerative development, perhaps to challenge, but more to transform their work, to evolve from that to regenerative development, but without taking out the energy that it's a good one in terms of they feeling that they are moving beyond just their business as usual by doing activities throughout the SDGs framework. Mm-hmm. So how do we then, you advise us to approach in the museums the idea of bringing regenerative lenses to sustainable development approach?
Well, I mean, again, we've to some extent talked about that potential in multiple facets already, that opening up, because so many museums have a kind of north-south relationship in their very essence because of the objects that they display and so on, opening up the conversation about that we do need a United Nations, that we do need the conversation about how do we live on this planet as a humanity in ways that allows diverse regenerative cultures to live in diverse ways within the context of their places. And so one way of, almost certainly there will be a notion in the UN, there is already one of creating the regenerative development goals post 2030. And to my mind, the big mistake of the UN agenda is that it's trapped in this abstraction process and the solving global problems process, and more conferences about solving global problems, and then creating global goals like the SDGs, and then spending ages in reporting and analyzing at national scale and beyond, but not spending the effort in asking people in place of how are these global goals relevant to you locally. And that's what I did with the Guy Education flashcards, is create a set of tools that any school, university, town hall, or museum could use to run events that say, you're invited from this community to come here to a workshop to learn more about this place and what's already going on here, and explore how these 17 goals could be meaningfully implemented in this place, and even map out how they're already being implemented, but maybe not under the label of them, and begin to do the Humpty Dumpty thing again of how here's the space of putting them all together and relating them, rather than saying we will focus on SDG number 5 or something. Teaching people a locally focused, place-sourced, regenerative way of working with these goals. Because what I think we would need more than anything is the local sustainable development goals, or the whether you call it sustainable or regenerative, I personally don't care. It's more, it needs to have that nestedness and that place-sourcedness and that attunement to place and to life's regenerative principles in it. And that for me is ultimately what regeneration is about, not the adjective we use. But the bridge is looking at the goals, looking at how they're relevant in place, looking at how they show up in place already and how you could interconnect them, but then also to without being dismissive and like creating dualistic opposites, to also really question some of the insidiousness of the global UN development agenda and the infrastructure it helped build post-Bretton Woods, that is the infrastructure of globalization, that is the infrastructure of economic neoliberal globalization, and that has, to some extent, repeated the obscenities of colonialization through another form of colonialization that was through digitalization and economic globalization. And this process is still going on. So how do we also use museums to, because at some point there will be a massive pendulum swing, and the danger is that then the United Nations will be completely out of credit and we won't have a forum for global conversation, and that would be terrible. So we need to be critical of that process and still supportive of the need for that kind of gremium. And that's a nuanced global local approach that museums can offer. And I also think that the UN is at a point where they understand that need to land in local context, and it's actually more of a political reason that they've not been able to focus on it more, because they have to be very careful to what extent they meddle with individual countries' jurisdictions. But that's again the potential of museums could be to hold these conversations around how are these goals relevant, and then that often brings people, if it's systemic enough of analysis, it brings people to the point of understanding that SDG number 8, continued economic growth and good work, is the Trojan horse in the system. It's the old system co-opting this good intent of the SDGs, because it's pretending that it's possible to continue to grow economically without growing our impact on the planet exponentially, and therefore killing ourselves. So again, that fundamental critique could also be a space that that museums can open up. The whole conversation about what does degrowth actually mean, and do we mean a shift from economic growth measured quantitatively by an insufficient measure like GDP towards a more qualitatively focused growth that is the growth in social cohesion, a growth in topsoil, a growth in healthy waterways, a growth in forest cover and biodiversity. So the nuanced conversations around what are the right terms that really resonate with people, and even the spaces to try out exactly that conversation, try them out with different age groups, like the potential of universities to not just reach out to schools and universities, but to old people's homes, and to even hold intergenerational conversations around that. Like imagine in the middle of one of these wonderful big halls and museums to have a intergenerational council where you have one question in the center, and you have people in their 40s, people in their 70s, 80s, and people in their teens, so speak to this question in a circle, and the others are just in the outer circle listening, and then you swap the circles around. That's the ancient technology of council brought into the modern context of a museum with a modern relevant question, and that's sacred work. It's hugely powerful.
I'm glad you brought to this. I recently became the vice chair of the ICOM Sustain, which is the major organization that comprises the network of museums globally. It's called ICOM, the International Council of Museums. And I am part of the working group of sustainability for 1 year now, and we just launched the committee. It was approved by the executive board. As I mentioned before, sustainability is now it's becoming official to the sector. But we decided as a committee that it's not called sustainability, at least it's called Sustainable Development Committee. And you're quite right, we are seeing the new generations coming in and challenging other generations, and we want to create this dialogue for new public policies that are much more informative of change instead of just giving answers and solutions. You mentioned the flashcards is great. I applied to 2 museums in Brazil, and many things eclode from there, especially seeing that people are doing great work and they didn't know that this could be related to sustainable development. They didn't call as such, but they were doing good things.
Did you write that up?
Sorry if I wrote that up?
Yeah, because I would love to, and also Gaia Education would love to tell that story of you.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I worked with 2 museums, the Afro-Brazilian Museum and the Science Museum in São Paulo, Catavento, with the flashcards. I did send to Manu in the Gaia Education Brazil. I used the methodology, and I think it was very informative of how Gaia Education, because I am a Gaia Education facilitator, and how I can then transfer that knowledge to museums. But then right after this, I moved to here, and then I meant to go back and continue doing this. And just one thought about, I think you touched upon the degrowth, which is great, because when we approach regenerative development with museums, we're trying to tell them that we can regenerate territories of knowledge, territories of knowing, territories, geographic territories, but sustainable development, it's part of it. It's how they understand it. And some authors have been discussing the idea of degrowth in museums, especially the discussion of dynamic collections, which I can also share with you. It's the whole idea of how degrowth can actually transform the museum's thinking for the future when we're starting understanding the dynamic notion of collections and not the static way of thinking of a collection. So it's and perhaps challenging the framework of economic growth unbalanced with the other social issues that we have to face. So yeah, that was very informative of what I have to do in Korea on the following month as well.
Yeah, just briefly there, again, there aren't actually that many places where people can learn about their context and the different things that are existing in a context. So on the kind of more social living museum side of things, to create the place where people can actually, like, as the museum shows a relationship to food, water, energy, local soils, local forests, local culture, to then also in those spaces begin to map out what are the initiatives that and existing organizations that act on cultural heritage, that act on soil regeneration and protection, that act on community-supported renewable energy or community-supported agriculture, or the link between health and food. And also basically in the collection, it's that living, the sort of the collection of that type of museum becomes the beautiful instances of regenerative impulse showing up in a given territory. So you collect the stories of just beautiful, meaningful, healing, sharing, nurturing, caring, protecting, regenerating, restoring stories. And you curate them all into a larger fabric that is, look, we don't need to wait until we design the Fata Morgana of a regenerative culture sometime in the future. There it is. That's our regenerative culture. And then you challenge the politicians and the universities and the money flows to say, here's the regenerative culture. If you want to do regeneration, just support what is already going on. And rather than supporting the conversation about more global extraction and dependencies. And that's a powerful process of degrowth to actually do that.
Yeah, that's really good. I would have many other questions and a lot of intentionalities and intentions of working more close to your thinking and bring your knowledge to the museum sector as well. But because of our time, I think I'm coming to an end of the interview. But thank you very much. I think I also want to hear your final thoughts, but really inspiring for us to bring this new level of energy and, as I said, flow of wisdom to museums to perhaps enter into a journey of how we can heal territories that go beyond the geographic places and understand how they can heal territories of knowledge and go beyond just the mechanicist way of thinking.
I mean, as I said, I really think that you're onto something hugely powerful. Also, the way that museums span beautifully the bridge into so many different, like from fine art to history to technology to biology and evolution, life sciences. It's really powerful, and I'd be really interested in supporting the thinking of a group of people that already feels excited about this and wants to really create that, take that impulse to the wider community of museums, and I think it's entirely also fundable. Like you will know the players on the inside of the system. If you put those together from some key museums and some key initiatives, and then we make a list of who we would actually like to talk to in a learning journey of doing what you've just done with me with those people, and creating a session with Fritjof, creating a session with Nora Bateson, creating a session with Bayo Akomolafe, creating a session with, I don't know, who else comes to Andreas Weber, and actually curate Satish, yeah, a lot, lots of people, to then really like help those practitioners who are already on this journey to hear these different voices, and with them live explore how they could co-create a new movement.
That's really good. I am collaborating with Bridget Mckenzie from the UK Climate Museum, especially also because I'm here. And when I look into the literacy that is available for regenerative thinking in museums, it doesn't exist. Although we have articles, podcasts, thinking that has been flourished to the sector, and one of them it's Bridget's work. So Bridget, she has been interviewed already for this research, and we plan to collaborate much more to co-create this network that can also influence the main forums of museums. So the museums associations, the ones that are spreading the word about sustainable development or sustainable thinking, can we also be more transformative or challenging those thinkings by bringing regenerative thinking into these main forums? We are keen to do this. Not only, of course, work independently as we're doing, but also influencing the forums that are the official forums to think in a different way.
Last thing before we both need to go. There was this movement, there is still this movement. I'm going to have a conversation about it in a couple of weeks' time. Somebody contacted me and Ben Haggett to say we need to bring more academically peer-reviewed published work out so academia can actually quote the people who have spent all this time building this field, rather than the first academics who wrote the first papers misunderstanding the whole notion of regeneration, but in the academic system are the first ones to have a paper cited that says regeneration in it. But there's a real dead, like a rock and a hard place situation there, because most of the people who have pioneered the practice aren't academics, or they were academics in the past and left that rigid system of how to write and the whole peer reviewing process that is ultimately dysfunctional, because you spend so much time fitting that mold of how to write in that way, and then ultimately very few people actually read that work, because so much is being published because the whole incentive system of academia is based on publications. And so it's really important to make these translations, but it's also like what I bumped into very quickly is that this lady, who clearly is an academic, was writing this expecting that Fritjof Capra and Lila June and Giles and Laura and I and Pamela and Ben and all those people would spend ages over an academic paper having to go through the process of getting their wings clipped of how they normally write to fit it into an academic mold, and then at the end pay 700 euros per paper to publish it in that. It's like they're not going to do it. Like it's really important to build this bridge, but that's another kind of research funding issue. Is what's actually needed is a much more well-resourced process to help these people, almost give them an academic co-author each, and to work with them to put this paper into the process of academia, because otherwise we'll have the situation that there is no quotable, officially accepted academic literature that from the people who actually
are doing.
So
So before I close the recording, let me do the protocols. This was an interview with Daniel Wahl, author of Design of Regenerative Cultures. I'm Lucimara Letelier. I am a practitioner and researcher on regenerative museums. This was a research for the University of Leicester, part of my research project as part of my museum studies program. We focus on social and environmental sustainability. You're going to have follow-up information about the report once this is released, and also all the outputs and outcomes out of the research.
Great.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
You have my permission to share this video widely, publicly, openly, and in any way you want to. Just so that's also
Thank
recorded.
you.